Megillat Esther for the next several weeks. So when I say several weeks, my guess is we're going to be talking about a long time, because Megillat Esther is 10 prakim, fascinating pieces. There's a history and there's also Mamarei Chazal throughout Megillat Esther. Just to understand one piece of background and why I chose to learn Megillat Esther right after we finished Sefer Daniel. And the answer is because they tie one into the next. The personalities are the same, and some of the same difficulties in terms of history are the same. So last week, when we studied a little bit of Rav Schwab's article, where he talks about the Sod Daniel, the missing 168 years in Jewish chronology, that missing 168 years impacts directly Megillat Esther of when that story occurred. According to Chazal, this story occurs between the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash and the rebuilding of the second Beit HaMikdash. In fact, it starts, the party which happens in the third year, which we're going to read about briefly, starts because Achashverosh does a calculation that's a little off. He figures 70 years beginning from the exile of Yehoiachim, which was earlier than the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash.
It's so weird. We, the Jews, are looking for some kind of end, and we make calculations. But you're telling us that the non-Jews are making the same calculations because you're trusting the Nevuah.
Well, so part of the challenge is, this is the way Chazal understood the third year. Historians understand the third year of his feast, and we'll see that because he returned from a major military operation, victorious, and it's a victory celebration. So Chazal, from the lens of Chazal, it's his miscalculation, and that's a Gemara in Masechet Megillah, Daf Yud Aleph Amud Aleph, where we talk about these miscalculations of how these things happened. But on the other hand, we also have other explanations. Now, according to Chazal, taking place right in the middle. However, according to history, when we look at Achashverosh, assuming it is Xerxes, which we totally mispronounce, because the X is not supposed to be pronounced as an X. It's more like a chet, it's a closer pronunciation of the way it's supposed to be said. If you look at Xerxes and when he ruled, Xerxes ruled during the time of the second Beit HaMikdash. How is that possible that this story is during the second Beit HaMikdash? It's because that 168 years. Were the 168 years really there? It pushes the whole story after Ezra and Nehemiah. And that whole story comes later in the history, parallel. And what really makes it an interesting shift is it changes a bit of our perspective of what's going on. Because if it is between the two Batei Mikdash where this is taking place in an exile with those people who were exiled and didn't have the opportunity yet to return to Eretz Yisrael. If I take the 168 years and I insert this and say it's after the Binyan Bayit, then I'm dealing with a population who chose not to go back to Eretz Yisrael after the decrees of Cyrus, etc. Yeah.
Isn't there? I'm confusing what I know with what you're saying. So you have to help me out here. So what I remember learning is that it was after the second bias was started and halted.
So that's talking about the Sitna. But if I look at the years, Xerxes himself, according to historians, he ruled from 485 BCE to 465 BCE. If you remember, Ezra and Nehemiah come back to Eretz Yisrael and they have this major gathering, the Amanah, the new covenant that they bring people in to rid themselves of the foreign wives, etc. They do that. That's 444 BCE. So actually, this whole piece takes place before the major re-engagement of Ezra and Nehemiah coming to Eretz Yisrael. Well, if it's 444, they come, but then Nehemiah comes also. Remember, Ezra and Nehemiah, they come too soon. Right, so it comes right around that time when they're coming back is where we see Xerxes, but Zerubbabel was already there. People had already started coming back to Eretz Yisrael. The level of building has shifted. It's already begun. There was the stop, there was the start again, and they've chosen not to go back. They've chosen not to be among those. Now, I don't want to put too much on this, but looking at it from that perspective, You then look at the Jews. Now, we know there was a very significant exile, as we have today, a very significant exile with Talmidei Chachamim, with regular people, but I'm looking at the people of Shushan a little differently, because I look at the people of Shushan as people who've chosen not to go back to Eretz Yisrael. The leadership, it could very well be that Mordechai was in a major position of leadership, as we'll see, in the palace, in the hierarchy of the Persian government, that he was serving an important role there. We're not going to criticize Chas v'Shalom Mordechai or Esther on this, but there are people who chose not to go to Eretz Yisrael. Yeah, Alida.
Isn't there something that says that Daniel was part of?
There's a medrash who says that Mimuchan, there's two completing pieces, and we're going to encounter his 7 advisors. Mimuchan being the one who gives the advice to send out this decree to all of the men of Shushan to undo the damage of Vashti. And there are 2 competing midrashim. One midrash says Mimuchan is Daniel. The other midrash says Mimuchan is Haman. A little different, each one from the other. Okay, and what those implications are. Again, it doesn't really, again, whether that 168 years is or isn't. If you take the position of historians, it's missing, and we have to try to explain it. If you take the position of Chazal, it's not there. Okay, and how we have to try to explain where the easiest way to explain is that, the history is messed up and we really don't know the history. And so why bother with something that we believe? But when I look at the differences of who these people are based on when they're living, that 168 years is a massive difference in time between pre-building second Beit HaMikdash to already the beginning of the return of the second Beit HaMikdash and the beginning of an establishment of something in Eretz Yisrael, where these people had chosen not to participate fully. Okay, that's the difference in the way we can look at this Megillah. It'll be interesting to look at it, it'll be interesting to study that a little bit more, but I want to get into the text. Now, one of the nice things about Megillat Esther, of probably all of Tanakh, this is probably the one piece of Tanakh that people know really well, because we at least hear it twice a year, and it's a great story. Unlike Daniel, which is clouded in mystery with dreams and things that have 27 different ways of understanding it, Megillat Esther seems to be just a wonderful story that has been made into a Hollywood movie a number of times. Okay, Sefer Daniel is never going to be made into a Hollywood movie. Okay, maybe into a jazz song sung by Louis Armstrong, but never into a full movie, because it's not a story, it's not a narrative in the normal fashion. So if you look at the beginning of the very first pasuk in Megillat Esther, Vayihi bimei Achashverosh, hu Achashverosh hamolech mihodu v'yad Kush. It was in the days of Achashverosh. Okay, who was Achashverosh, who was ruling from Hodu at Kush, from India to Ethiopia? We know the Persian Empire was massive. Okay, it covered all of the Middle East of that nature. But what's interesting in the opening of the pasuk is we don't refer to him as a king. It doesn't say Vayihi bimei melech Achashverosh, and it doesn't say Vayihi bimei Achashverosh hu melech Achashverosh, but rather it's in the days of Achashverosh who was ruling mihodu v'yad Kush, and that's the reason in the Gemara that Rav says that Achashverosh was a usurper. He really wasn't the legitimate king. He shouldn't have risen up into that road, and that's where we're coming from, because he's losing the title of Melech. Interestingly, we now know from Persian history that Achashverosh wasn't the direct next person after Darius, Cyrus, Cambyses, Darius, Achashverosh, but rather Daryavesh had older sons. And Achashverosh himself in Persepolis, which in one of the capital cities of the ancient Persian Empire, in an inscription in the walls in the temple or the palace of Persepolis, he writes that he was a younger son of Daryavesh, and he had convinced his father that he should be the one who should take over versus the older brothers. So Chazal anticipated it just from the language itself. They saw something there. They may not have known that particular piece of Persian history, but they knew how to read the text, and they knew that something was strange here, and the Gemara picked up on it right away. Now, in this piece, okay, we again don't know exactly when it's taking place. We do identify Achashverosh as Xerxes. This goes back to the religious Jewish historians, Ador Shav of Weiss, and goes back to Zev Yavitz and his histories, to the late 19th century, early 20th century, when we already had these excavations and the archaeological discoveries, and people started questioning who was the one, because you'll find elsewhere in Chazal that they sometimes identify Artaxerxes, another king, with Achashverosh. But now it seems to be, according to most positions, there are still other positions. According to most positions, we're talking about this king who we know in English as Xerxes 585 to 565 BCE. And this is already, in the time, if this is that Achashverosh, that means that Mordechai and Esther and the people in this story had chosen not to go back to Eretz Yisrael yet at that point. Let's put it this way. Yeah.
Community basically in Persia,
Well, it was Bavel. Bavel is Persia in that case, right? That's Iraq. We have the city of Susa. In fact, there was a Chicago family whose family that they had left behind in Iran were responsible for the graves of Mordechai and Esther, the Devatkar family who live in Skokie. Their siblings were the ones who were responsible to this day of looking after the graves of Mordechai and Esther, which are there. And the Persian community has a tradition of where their graves are. And we also have, and I'm give it to you, and I'm sorry it didn't come out as good as I expected it. We have the excavations, which I had sent last night in an email. We have the excavations of the city of the palace of Achashverosh's palace, these are real excavations, and these are the real plans of them. So we are able actually to look at the story of Esther, and at the same time see these plans and it fits perfectly. So these are the kinds of excavations. They originally, the first book I found was from Aaron Marcus in Kadmoniot, which was early in the 20th century when he wrote it. But this is a much later piece. This is a new book that just came out recently that has even more detail to it. So we know these things happen. Hu Achashverosh. Now the Megillah says.
Can I have a question?
Yeah,
real quick?
please. Yeah.
I thought that Achashverosh's whole dynasty came from Vashti. I thought she was the lineage, not.
Well,
him.
Vashti, according to Chazal, Vashti, and we'll encounter her, is the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. She was a princess who Achashverosh married.
Right.
Now, in terms of the chronology, again, it gets a little complicated because Nebuchadnezzar lived, according to historians, 100 years before Achashverosh ruled. Okay, if, however, I collapse those years, yeah, then it's doable.
Or she could have been a granddaughter.
Could have been a granddaughter. We talk about her being a daughter. We talk about her being part of the role that she had, and we'll see that in the next few psukim when we get past the beginning of the very first pasuk. Okay, but there's so much here. So, by the way, I don't want the history to really distract us from the messages, but the history is something that's really interesting, fascinating, and kind of cool, because while there is no historical evidence for the story of Purim in archaeological finds, nevertheless, there's very little to disprove the story of Purim. Some of it sounds a little fantastic, but it sounds fantastic to us because we see the Yad Hashem, and you would expect some things perhaps recorded, but we don't have everything from the Persian Empire. There's a lot that's missing. And so it's the history piece is always fascinating. Yeah.
But how can we say that there's no evidence if, like, Independence Day, July 4th, everybody's celebrating it? Purim, everybody is celebrating. All the Jews were collapsed into the sphere of this dominating empire. That is evidence.
Yeah, but we have evidence from our tradition. But if I go into the archaeological finds and I try to see, does this match? do I find anywhere the name Esther or Mordechai. Okay, now we do know Mordechai and Esther were Persian names. They were Marduk, okay, and also Istara. Okay, we know that in Esther's that it was a Persian name, and I'm sorry not to get to the pasuk so much. Persian name for the effect that Megillah tells us again that her real name was Hadassah. Okay, she had her non-Jewish name and she had her Jewish name. And Astara was gods, were Persian gods. Marduk and Astara were Persian gods. Astara comes from the word star, like we have the star. Okay, so these names fit. When I look at the palace, and I look at this palace in the story, I'm going to be able to follow the story and see where they were moving around in the palace. That fits. Is it absolute proof? No, but it's not disproof. And it's kind of interesting how we can use this to help us understand better. There's the Persian period, again, is the real mystery in Jewish history. What happened, but it's a mystery also in general history. There's still things being discovered. There's still excavations that are being taking place and pieces to understand ever more. So again, I'm just going to go back to the pasuk. So this is in the days of Achashverosh. Chazal noted clearly that it doesn't say he was the king, okay, which is interesting, but he did rule, and it says Hu Achashverosh. It repeats twice. Chazal say that he was consistent. Okay, that he is evil from beginning to end. That's the Achashverosh. Otherwise, why do you have the additional Achashverosh? But the Ibn Ezra says differently. He is the Achashverosh who ruled over the 127 kingdoms, Sheva v'esrimu me'ah medina, versus other kings with the same first name, Achashverosh, but they were, and we find this in history, the same names repeating themselves, even in the, you even have Queen Elizabeth II, right? We have earlier Elizabeth, the names repeat themselves, but we're talking about, says the Megillah, the Achashverosh who ruled over 127 kingdoms. Now, the 127 kingdoms, again, is a little problematic. Nowhere do we find in the Persian records of that time the number 127, but it's entirely possible. It just depends how you count. Are you counting? The word Medina has different meanings at different times. It could be what we would call a region, a county, a country. We know that he ruled from Hodu v'ad Kush, and exactly how you break it up into the 127 is not so simple. But what's more interesting is the number 127, because we know that the 127 appears only one other place in Tanakh, and that's the age of Sarah Imenu, which is the source of other midrashim as well that arise. And there's some areas of trying to find some comparisons between Sarah Imenu, who died at 127, and this story of Megillat Esther. It all runs within the realm of midrash. But we also know, because of the vast conquests he had, the Malbim points out that in the course of those conquests, and this goes back to Alita's point, he conquered the area and he was able to take Vashti, who was the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, to be his wife. Vashti had a regal bearing and a regal sense. She understood what it was. Now, at the same time, okay, according to the Midrash, because he married Vashti, he felt this adds to his importance. There was some illegitimacy of his claim to the throne. Vashti would lend that legitimacy to his throne. We're not really sure, okay? But that's the piece of the puzzle that we have. And in terms of the counting, Sheva v'yasrimu me'ah medina, Rav Moshe Chalav says, actually, this is the way the Tanakh, you start from the small and move up. We had the same thing also with Sarah, where we had a beautiful midrash of Sarah that talking about how each phase of her life overlapped, like a 7-year-old, like a 20-year-old, okay, even though she was 120. Bayamim ahem. Now, in those days, after the king had really established his rule, explains Rashi, okay, Keshevet HaMelech Achashverosh al Kisei Malchuto. When King Achashverosh is sitting on his royal throne. Now notice, we went from calling him just Achashverosh now to King Achashverosh, HaMelech Achashverosh, which allows Rashi to say he's confident now in his role. Now he was able to claim full authority. Asher b'Shushan HaBirah. It was taking place in Shushan HaBirah. Now, Birah in modern Hebrew means capital. But Bira really doesn't mean capital. Bira means fortress. And as a result of that, the Ibn Ezra points out in his second comment that Shushana Bira means that there were really two cities we're talking about. There was the fortress of Shushan, and there was the general city of Shushan. Achashverosh is sitting within the palace, which is a fortress. If you look again at the diagram, which I had shared, you'll see it is all sitting on, it was actually 3 mounds. There were 3 tells that we find, but all on one tell is this one fortress of an area which covers, and you see it's a topographical map, so you see it's high up, right? And you see all of these different areas just of the palace. That's Shoshana Bira. Around it, says the Ibn Ezra, is where everybody else lived. So he's there in the Shoshana Bira. And so like when it says later on, Ir Shushan Navocha, says the Ibn Ezra, it's important. There's a difference in Shushan Bira and the Ir Shushan. Shushan Bira is the fortress where Achashverosh lived. Ir Shushan is where the commoners lived. What did he do? Bishnat Shalosh L'Malcho. In his 3rd year, Asamishtem, he went ahead and he made a party. Now, interestingly, this word mishteh, by the way, appears in Megillat Esther 20 times. In all of Tanakh, it only appears 26 times. So if you want to talk about a milah mancha, one of these guiding words that lets you understand tone, mishteh is one of those words. Mishteh, this is, they're one party after the next. Achashverosh does this mishteh. And again, this mishteh based on the Gemara, as the Ibn Ezra also points out, he did it because he felt already now was the time the Jews should have been redeemed. The Jews were not redeemed, okay? And I'm now able to celebrate. I'm safe, I have them. However, the Ibn Ezra already introduces that this may have been already after some time he had conquered other lands. He had gone out on a military excursion and had come back victorious. And the Ibn Ezra even says there's a 3rd possibility, okay, that's when he married Vashti, okay, which also can explain, says Rabbeinu Bechai, why Vashti is going to be making a parallel celebration. La Havdal, Elef Havdalot, Sheva Brachos, okay. The big parties, okay? They're parties after the marriage, but who does he make it for? L'chol sarav avadav, he makes it for all of his ministers and everyone else who is there. Chel Parasumadai, the soldiers of Persia and Media, we need to remember, Persia and Media are still they co-joined as a single empire. Hapartamim, Visaream Dinot Lefanav. Including the Partamim, these were the people who were the highest echelons of leadership, and the Sarei HaMedinot, the people who were over the various 127 countries he had. Rashi says Partamim is a Persian word, which means the rulers. Okay, the Ralbag disagrees and says, well, they're kind of rulers, but it's not a ruler over an individual, but these were rulers over several countries. But what we're saying is Achashverosh is making this party for the highest echelons of people. Baharoto et osher kivod malchuto et yakar tiferet gedulato. And what he's doing is he was trying to show off the wealth and all of the honor he had, and the glory of his greatness. Yamim Rabim Shmonim Umat Yom. The party lasted for 180 days. Now, why would the king want to do this? The king's doing this because he wants to show how important he is. I shared with you a copy of an interesting book called The Dawn, which was written by Yoram Hazoni. Yoram Hazoni wrote this book, and he used Megillat Esther as a study in leadership. And he goes through Megillat Esther as a study in leadership and power throughout the Megillah. So I'll quote from him a lot because he has some fascinating insights. But if you look on page 15, and I will pull it up for those who are not here at this moment. Let me just, if you give me one moment, I'll get it. One more moment. Sorry. So if you, okay, so if you look on page 15, which is right now over here, I'm going to start reading from the second paragraph from the bottom on the right side on page 15. And being such a one, Achashverosh is the archetype of a political ruler. All spirit, he'll do anything to feel that he has control over others. But having no reason of his own to speak of, he has no idea what to do with the rule. Okay, and this is an important piece we're going to see right now. He's showering them, as in the paragraph before, such a man is Achashverosh, king of Persia, who for want of the feeling of power over others devotes half a year of his life to filling the nobles and commoners of his empire with drink, showering them with gifts, boasting to them of his wife, that they should better recognize his greatness. This is Achashverosh, and we need to keep in mind what he is about, and we'll see how that's all going to play out. Going back to the text itself, it's 180 years he's doing this. And the Yakar, by the way, when we talk about that Yakar Tiferet, okay, according to the Medrash, what is Tiferet? The ultimate Tiferet is he took out the Bigdei Kahuna and he dressed himself up as the Kohen Gadol. He used this to show his greatness. The reason we use this is what's the l'shem tiferet is a word we find when we talk about the Bigdei Kehuna, okay, that it's going to be for the sense of glory, and Chazal connect it if he's living during the time of the exile, after the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, and he's the successor nation to Bavel. He has taken over all of these pieces, which we see later on also with the utensils he's going to be using, that according to Chazal and according to our tradition, were from the Beit HaMikdash, even the way we lane it. You know, we switch into an Eicha tune when we talk about the Kelim Mikelim Shonim, where because we recognize these were things he was taking to show his greatness, the way these leaders showed their greatness was by to show their power over others. And then, okay, when the 180 years were ending up, okay, at that point, he made another party. And the party was for a broader range of people, the people who were closer to him geographically. Rav and Shmuel in the Gemara have a disagreement. I'm sorry, in the Medrash have a disagreement. The Medrash in Esther Rabbah says, did this party take place, was it 180 years plus 7? Or was it the last 7 days of the 180 years? Not that it makes a mess, huh? 180 days, 180 days, I'm sorry. The 180, was it the beginning or was it right afterwards or at the end of them? We don't know for sure. But what did he do? He made a party for all the people nearby him. Now, the Gemara in Megillah and Daf Yud Bet says, Amud Aleph, says that there's another machloket. Was this strategy of first making a party, a massive party, for all of the upper echelons of government, and then making a party for 7 days for his geographically close people, was it a smart move or a stupid move? Rav says that Achashverosh was pikeach. He was a very intelligent person. And what he did is he knew that the people who lived in Shushan were loyal. What he didn't know is if the people who were beyond Shushan would be loyal to him. And therefore, what he first does is he wines and dines them to get their loyalty, but he doesn't want to forget the people nearby. So he goes this route and then that route. However, Shmuel says, and this is a machloket that goes throughout the Medrash, was Achashverosh very bright or was he stupid? Machloket is, was he a melech pikeach or a melech tipesh? Shmuel says that he was tipesh, and the reason why is, first go ahead and strengthen your immediate ties with the people around you, then start going out on the outside. We have to go ahead and consider the possibilities. Ultimately, it's possible, says Rabbi Yoshua Bachrach, who used to teach for many Zal, who used to teach many years at Michlala, he writes that he was probably both. There's an element, sometimes you have intelligence and sometimes you have stupidity. You could view it from two different perspectives, but sometimes when you're making the choice, you don't know the consequence. You have to do it one way or the other. And he chose to do that. And he chose to also go l'chol ha'am, for the people. Now, who were the chol ha'am? According to Rabbi Yaakov of Lisa, he said that he viewed himself that he wanted to include not just his people, but the people. Who are the people? Klal Yisrael. So he invited the Jews there as well. And in fact, the Midrash says that ultimately he was interested in getting the Jews to sin, getting them to eat non-kosher, getting to drink the wine of the king, which was wine that was used in libations for pagan gods. He wanted to bring them down. Where does the Medrash find this in the words? Because it doesn't say l'chol ha'amim, for all the nations, but it says ha'am, the nation. Says the Midrash, what it could possibly be the nation, the Jewish people. He tried to engage them. But there is a different Midrash of the Panim Achirim, says that ultimately the Jews did not participate in this at all. They didn't want to be with him. And that's because they were repulsed when they realized all of the things he was using from the Beit HaMikdash. They didn't want to have a piece of it. Which Medrash is correct? We don't know. They're two opposite forms of the Midrashim. Ultimately, the Pshat, you don't see it. L'chol ha'am can also be all of the people, and not the peoples, but the people can be from multiple nations who were there nearby. Where did this party take place? Migadol v'ad katan shivat yamim b'chatzar ginat bitan hamelech. It took place in the garden. Now, where is this garden? And again, I shared with you that picture, and I'll share it with everyone on the screen now. If you look at the picture that you have, you'll notice that that this is his palace. So the Ginat Bitan ultimately is outside. Where is it outside? It's number 2. So number 2, this was a large area. Those little squares are these massive columns. The columns were approximately 60 feet high. The massive columns. This was an outer area beyond the private residence of the palace, which are like 4, 5, 6, 7, those numbers over there. And this was a big place to be able to do it, a large area. That is the Chatzar Ginat Habitan that we're talking about. Next to it, by the way, if you notice, is number 13, which we also have, okay, where we have the Ginah. So the Bitan is the 2, the Ginah 13, which is right next to it, is an open area as well, because it overflowed. You had so many people coming, you had all of these things together. And what did they have there? Okay, they had Chur, Karpas, and Tchelet, that ultimately they had these draperies that were made of the finest colors. Color in the ancient world, the dyes were a very precious thing. Remember, there was purple, was a royal dye, the tchelet we know about. So the chur, karpas, and tchelet, chur is white. We have in Hebrew, chivur, chet, vav, vav, resh, which is also white. And this was what they had white draperies. They had karpas. Okay, the karpas is a greenish color, according to our understanding. And again, we're not 100% sure on that. But by the way, this is also where Rabbeinu Manoach teaches that when we talk about the Ketonet Pasim, that was also from the Karpas, that it's a fine, that was that kind of special material. And that's why the Rabbeinu Manoach says that on Pesach, at the Leil Seder, we eat Karpas to remember Yosef. In other words, the way the Haggadah works is we start out the Haggadah. We don't just talk about Exodus. The first thing we do is we eat karpas to remember how they got down to Egypt, by remembering the chur, karpas, utchelet, karpas being the same word as pasim, as that striped coat that Yosef had, or whatever that coat was. And those different utchelet we know, that's the blue, achuz bechevlevutz va'argaman. And these draperies were held back, okay, with chevle boots va'argaman, meaning that they had small, boots is small linen threads, argaman is the purple thread, so those were the ties to the draperies. Al glilei chesev amudei shesh, and these were being hung from marble pillars with golden, with silver rings that were adorning them. Yeah.
So if I were to read about the inaugural banquet that's being held in the White House, why would I even spend time discussing if it's, a large message, the fabric of the curtains and how they're held together, and why digress?
Well, we're talking about all of the decorations, and I think that your example is perfect, because if you read over the last several weeks, they have been talking about the first ladies decorating for Christmas of the White House, the decorations of the palace, and the White House is a palace in many ways. When I had the privilege with Margaret to go to the White House for Hanukkah, everybody said, what was it like? And the first thing we described was the Marine Corps band playing. I had a little dreidel in full dress, and you had the Christmas decorations because they were up, but you also had Hanukkah decorations. You talk about those kinds of things, and it's part of the impressiveness. Now, if you think about that picture, which I had shown you again about the Bitan, okay, of that area, and if you look at that picture again, you'll notice that in that picture, you have all of these columns. So if you can imagine where all of those little squares are columns, if you can imagine all of those columns are ornate at this point. Not only are they massive, and they have found the columns, some of the remains of the columns, 60-foot columns, okay, and they were made out of marble. And in fact, there are documents from the Persian period, inscriptions, that talk about the fact that they were imported, because they didn't have natural marble there. And they could have built them from stone. They could have, one of the documents, I think it was in Persepolis, which is one of the other palaces, says that it would have been cheaper to make those columns out of gold and silver than out of marble, because gold and silver they had. They didn't have marble. So all of these columns are decorated like that. And then in addition to it, what do you have? You have mitot zahav chesef. You have couches that are made with gold and silver. Al ritzpat bahat vashesh vadar v'socharet. And you have, Rashi just says, these are various kinds of precious stones which were used as the tile on the floors. Bahat is alabaster. Dar are pearls. Socharet is a black marble, okay? And it could just be, by the way, just different colors, but you're walking in and you're seeing all above you, all below you, all around you. And then you have vashkot b'kli zahav, and they were drinking out of silver goblets, v'chelim mikelim shonim. Zahav, I'm sorry, gold. V'chelim mikelim shonim. Okay, and the Gemara says they were using different kinds of utensils. The different kinds of utensils, it should have said mikelim mishunim zemizeh. Why does it say kelim mikelim shonim? Says the Midrash, these were the clay Beit HaMikdash that had been taken. They were using them. Okay, Rashi just says these were different one from the other. They had all these kinds of utensils that they were using. Now, ultimately, which is interesting, the Chachmei Tzarfat, in their explanation on Megillat Esther, says that they were bringing different kinds of utensils. This was a way of showing off wealth. And I just as a somewhat of a side note, years ago, you would go to a fancy restaurant and everything matched, all the plates matched, right? Nowadays, you go to a fancy restaurant, and it's like they have seconds of everything. Fancy plates, but this plate isn't like that plate, like that plate. And that's nowadays, we've picked up this idea of kelim shonim again, versus what once was in America. And in their day, according to the Chachmei Tzarfat, this is also, I'm showing all of the beautiful different utensils because each one was a work of art. And so if you have the same work of art over and over again, it isn't as impressive as if you have different kinds of works of art that you're using to serve these things. And ultimately, the Yein Malchut Rab Ki Ad HaMelech, and the amount of wine was massive, as much as the king could possibly provide.
I have a question. Because of the medrash that these were kelim from the Beis HaMikdash, is that the source of the custom that we say those words?
Yes. That's why we use it with an echad trop, because we say this is our sense of mourning that's based on that midrash. Not everyone accepts that midrash, but there is that midrash, and traditionally, he said the reason when we lay Megillat Esther, these words, v'kelim, v'kelim, shonim, we use the trop of echa, which is a variation. The trop of Esther is just like it's a difference of speed, okay, between the two, and so we switch into that trop. V'hashtiya chet. Vashtiya kedat enones. According to the rule, the law, there was no one who was forced to drink or not to drink. Interestingly, everyone got to do what they wanted to do, which implies, Chazal say, okay, that there were other kinds of celebrations where people were forced. You have to drink this. Everyone was able to be made comfortable. But what's fascinating is the very next phrase. Kichen yisad hamelech al kol rav beito lasod kirtzon ish ve'ish. The king went ahead and he established this rule over anyone, that everyone could make their own choice. Now, what's fascinating about this phrase, this is the only decision of Achashverosh in the entire Megillah. Every other thing that we talk about Achashverosh is told what to do, and he will agree or disagree or say, I can't do anything else. Everywhere else, Achashverosh is dependent on others. The only decision we have of Achashverosh in the entire Megillah is that people can decide how much they want to drink. Now, that says a lot about Achashverosh. Now, if you go back for a moment to that piece which I had brought up before from Hazoni, and I'll share it on the screen again. As soon as I find it, I apologize. You should be able to see it now. The piece from Hazoni, if you look, going back to that paragraph I had started reading, and being such a one, Achashverosh is the archetype of a political ruler, all spirit. He'll do anything to feel that he has control over others, but having no reason of his own to speak of, he has no idea what to do with his rule. Indeed, Achashverosh never makes a decision of substance on his own in the entire book of Esther. Instead, he is, as one rabbinic commentator has it, an axe in the hand of the wielder, initiating neither evil nor good, but applying the full force of his authority in whatever direction will make him feel most in control at a given moment. The result is that despite having vast powers at his disposal, Achashverosh is at all times propelled by the pressures and manipulation of those around him, as is the state itself. With this in mind, let's return to the king's party. In the entire stew of ostentatious excess and flattery, which comprises the description of the feast, perhaps the most interesting detail is the liberty which the king accords the merrymakers. And the drinking was in accord with the law that none should be compelled. For so the king had instructed all the officers in his house that they should do anything according to each man's will. That the king had seen fit to issue such an order itself indicates how unusual it was for his government to concern itself with the will of his subjects. The presumption, of course, was that if one were invited to a royal carnival for 6 months, one came, and if one were given wine to drink in abundance, one drank wine in abundance, and the king's officers would ensure this was the case. The great rabbinic exegete, Rabbi Levi, emphasized the point by suggesting that normally the officers would have preferred to kill a guest rather than let him offend the king by abstaining. They had a great flagellum and would pour out of it for every individual, even if he died, even if he went insane, they would not let him be until he had drunk all of it. In this figure, Persia is the party, and the king's officers were themselves the flagon, pouring the king's rule down the throats of his subjects, even unto insanity, even unto death. Achashverosh, however, makes an instructive exception. He knows that he may demonstrate his power by issuing commands and having them obeyed, yet he senses he can achieve more by granting a small measure of freedom, for the spirit seeks a control over others which is not sated by mere physical obedience. Certainly, Achashverosh wants to feel that his subjects fear him and will do his bidding, but he wants much more. To truly feel he controls his people, he needs to rule their emotions first and foremost. He needs to make them love and respect him to desire his rule. There's no better way of gaining the gratitude of others than by using your power to bestow liberty, for this means granting a gift of power to another. For those whom Achashverosh has invited into his palace, accustomed they are to submitting to the wishes of the king. This microscopic one-time grant of power can win their gratitude as no material gift. It is no coincidence either that the material gift of choice is alcohol, an agent whose action is directly on the spirit, releasing inhibitions, steadying the nerves, making the heart merry, all of these affections deriving from a chemically enhanced sense of power and control. Now, it's interesting when you look at this piece about Achashverosh, what you realize right away is that what's happening here is Hazoni is taking the opinion of Rav, that Achashverosh was a melech pikeach. He was very smart. He knew, give them some choice, but just make it an inconsequential choice. But nevertheless, since they've never had choice before, you give them a little bit of choice, they think, wow, this is an amazing king. He'll let us do so many things. Whereas, according to the Shmuel position, this man is a fool, he's a tipesh. Well, Achashverosh, the only decision he makes in his entire monarchy recorded by the Megillah is mocking him regarding how much drink you would have, everything else he's not. It could be he is very, very politically astute, and it could be that he is totally clueless. Odds are, by the way, the political astuteness. Experience generally has when people rise to certain roles of power, and remember, Achashverosh maintained his rule for 20 years. There's a whether it is a Machiavellian type of power or some other. Generally, they're very, very intelligent in how they're able to keep people close by, even in the ancient world itself. So right now we've had this party, but what we have at the party now comes the famous piece. Gam Vashti Malka Asata Mishte Nashin Beit HaMalchut. Now notice, Vashti, unlike Achashverosh, is immediately identified as a queen. Okay, why is she immediately identified as a queen? Well, there's a couple of possibilities. One is she was from royal lineage. She's known as Malka, maybe even more than Achashverosh was known as Melech at the beginning. The other possibility, okay, is that he wanted, specifically, Achashverosh wants to highlight that she is the queen. He's not just bringing a wife, he wants to highlight she is the queen. And so as a result, she does this in her Beit Malchut Asher Lemelech Achashverosh, and according to the theories today, the place that she does it in is once again in a section of the section of the monarchy. Where's that section? It's appearing, and just with your permission for a moment again, let me just pull it up. It is at the southern end of the palace where she is having her party. It would be down at 8. Okay, so the men's party is up in 2 and 13. The women's party is down in the Beit HaNashim, which is down here at the bottom of this area. Okay, so that's an 8. And so she's in the Beit HaNashim. They are up there. It's not a long walk. If you notice, it's probably 100, 150 meters away. Not a big amount of place, but she's doing it Asher Lemelech Achashverosh, which is in the place of Achashverosh. Bayom HaShvi'i. Now, on the 7th day, yeah.
But it doesn't say Beit HaNashim, it says Beit HaMalchut.
Right, but ultimately it's within the palace area. So the assumption is it's probably down here, away from everyone else. Now, Bayom HaShvi'i, it's the 7th day. Now, the 7th day, again, remember, could either be 187 days after the party started, or it could be the 180th day when everybody's together, the culmination of all. Kitov lev hamelech b'yayin. Okay, he now has had a very nice time to himself. Okay, and he is, let's assume he is drunk. Okay, Amar lim human bista charvona bikta v'avkata zeta v'charkas shivata sarisim. He tells the 7 eunuchs, Hamishartim epnei hamelech Achashverosh, the following. But what's interestingly, it's Yom HaShvi'i. So because it says Yom HaShvi'i, Rashi quotes Chazal and says this was on Shabbos. And this whole event happened on Shabbos because it was a punishment to Vashti. That what Vashti would do is any Jewish girls who were in the harem, she would force them on Shabbos to be naked and to be working to be Mechalel Shabbos. And so as a result, on a Shabbos, she is going to get her comeuppance. That's what the Medrash says about this. And it's again based on the word Hashvi. Okay. Now, that works on a midrashic level. However, on a pshat level, the main thing to remember is it's the seventh day. It's the end of everything, the culmination of it all. And he is drunk. And at that point, according to Bachrach, using a principle of nichnas yain yetzesod, this is something he had always wanted to do. Now, what does he want to do? He tells them, Laviat Vashti Malka lifnei Hamelech becheter malchut, to bring Vashti with her royal crown. Okay. Now, if I'm going ahead, okay, royal crown to be bringing her, this is the idea of showing her off, right? I want everyone to know this is the queen. Now, by showing her off to everyone, this is the queen, it's also demeaning to her. Let's assume for a moment she was the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, and at one point she had provided legitimacy for his rule. He's now saying, once upon a time you thought she was important, now look, she's unimportant. Okay, the other thing is she comes in right after those descriptions of the ornate magnificence of the palace. She's one more object. And being one more object, again, is demeaning. He's just trying to show off what he is. Could be he's trying to get even, to state he has risen above her. It could be he's viewing her just as one more object. And it is, if you remember, according to the Midrash, when it says Becheter Malchut, that all he wanted her to be wearing was the Keter Malchut, Laharot Ha'amim V'asarim et Yofya, Ki Tovat Marahi, because she was very, very beautiful. V'tima'en Hamalka Vashti Lavo B'dvar Melech, and she refused. Now, why did she refuse? Well, very simply, if she was going to be shown as an object, just one more possession of Achashverosh, she doesn't want to be that. Her dignity is above that, without talking about what the issues of whether she had leprosy or whether she had a tail or whether she was coming naked. Forget all those other things. The Chachmei Tzarfat say very simply, she's a queen. She's not going to go out to this. Okay. The Ralbag says, by the way, she's refusing to come for a different reason. Her dignity demands she's not being brought in by the seven eunuchs of the king. You want Achashverosh, you want me to come? Send me a letter. You come yourself, come get me. I don't work that way. Rashi says, based on the Gemara, the famous Midrash, that she refused to come, and that refusal, by the way, was an insulting note that she sent to Achashverosh also. She really did it, because we'll see from the next pasuk that he gets angry. But Rashi says because she had tzarat. She had leprosy. Now, we're going to end on this. I'll just share with you a thing I've never forgotten on this one midrash, and that is that I remember many years ago, there was a coloring book that came out of Lakewood for Purim, and it was a cute coloring book, and there was poor Vashti there, and so they had a picture to color in Vashti. Vashti was naked, but very tzniustic the way it was shown. Okay, but she had a tail. And she also had tzarat. Those are three different positions in Chazal. If she had a tail, she didn't have tzarat. And if she had tzarat, she didn't have a tail. And if she was being brought in naked, she didn't have necessarily either one of those two. But, sometimes this goes back to the conversation we had last week. Midrash makes it on the comic book level, but it was kind of cute. And if you ask any of the little kids in school, the tail, they'll remember much more. And the reason is it's much easier to explain to kids. She didn't want to come because she had a tail, than explaining they wanted her to bring her naked, because kids will make faces at that. Okay. And they'll joke about it. We're going to pick up with this next week. Next week, just an apology. The show will be about 5-10 minutes shorter. I have to end a little bit earlier because I have a conflict. I have to be somewhere else at 10 o'clock. Welcome to Megillat Esther.
Thank you. Next week I should be in Detroit. Hopefully I'll be able to come in from